Good evening and welcome to Q&A live from the Founders Theatre at Federation University in Ballarat. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, the opposition leader, Bill Shorten. Please welcome our guest. Thank you very much. Now, David Marr's quarterly essay paints Bill Shorten as a consummate backroom party man who's risen to the top without ever really being tested by Australian voters. According to the polls, 8 days ago he was coasting towards a lodge in front of one of Australia's most unpopular prime ministers. Now he's facing Malcolm Turnbull at a much tougher challenge. But tonight, it's the testing questions of both Labor and Coalition voters who want to know more about the alternative Prime Minister. Let's go straight to our first question. It's from Steve Theodore.
Good evening. With all due acknowledgement to Bill Hayden, a drover's dog could have led the ALP to electoral victory over a government led by Tony Abbott. Do you acknowledge that the ascension of Malcolm Turnbull has made your job a lot harder and that your leadership is now a lot less secure?
Let me just state at the outset that I'm not going to be merely miffed about the rise of Malcolm Turnbull replacing Tony Abbott. I think it is a good thing for this country that Tony Abbott's no longer Prime Minister of Australia. Now, of course...
Now the boost to Malcolm Turnbull.
I pretty much covered that. Of course, though, I would like to have been the one who replaced Tony Abbott, because whoever did that was going to get a boost in the polls, as they say. But what I'm looking forward to is a change not in the personalities of who the Liberal leaders are, but a change in the way we do politics in this country. You know, I understand that the last 2 years have been deeply unsatisfactory to Australians. Labor has been making that point for the last 2 years, and to some extent, we take some, satisfaction that because we stood strong against the 2014 budget and the 2015 budget, because we didn't cop the pension cuts and the broken promises, that put more pressure on a first-term Liberal government than I think the experts were saying would occur, and certainly Mr Abbott. So now what I'm hoping with the rise of Malcolm Turnbull is not just a change in salesman, but a change in direction for this country. And we'll have a debate about who's got the best plan for the future, because that's what I really think matters. And let's have a debate about ideas and not some of the negative shouting, the dividing of this country that we've seen really, I think the last 2 years has underestimated Australia.
Okay, now I read in David Marr's essay that you admire Napoleon, especially for his maxim, find your enemy's weakest point and concentrate your attack there. Is that true, first of all, that you admire Napoleon?
I admire Napoleon. I think he's a great figure of history, yes.
So Malcolm Turnbull's weakest point, what is that?
I'm not sure what that'll be yet. I think
you can only see his strengths at this time.
Well, no, I just think he's been there for 6 days, that's all. Well, I don't think they shall know that. What I believe is the challenge will be for Malcolm Turnbull will be, can he move his party, which is more right-wing than the Liberal Party's been in decades, can he move it through its policies back to the centre of Australian politics? See, I'm up for a debate about the future. We will have arguments, Malcolm Turnbull and I, but there'll be things we agree on too. But I think it's really important that Malcolm Turnbull doesn't change his views that he had when he was the sort of Liberal gadfly, giving Tony Abbott a hard time, and that I hope that he sticks true to his views about climate change, about marriage equality, about making sure that we can have a debate about ideas and we don't just get back into the politics as usual.
Okay, next question will take us to some of what you were just mentioning there. It's from Belinda Jones.
Malcolm was last ousted as leader of the Liberal Party due to his support for a world-leading carbon trading scheme. Yet now he thinks that our joke of a direct action plan is sufficient. Mr Shorten, you are famous for your role in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd fiasco, flipping allegiance to then remake a Prime Minister. At what point does pursuing political survival become more important than upholding your own principles and values?
Well, I actually think there's 2 parts to your question, or 2 points in your question. I'd like to answer them both, and I'll try and do it as succinctly as I can. The leadership instability in Labor in the last 6 years that Labor was in, I think caused a lot of harm. Now, it was done to try and prevent Tony Abbott and a more extreme view of Australia come to the fore, but ultimately that failed too. So Labor, it was very difficult. It was very difficult, but I think that Labor has learned its lessons. For the last 2 years, one thing you haven't had out of Labor is a whole lot of discussion about our disunity and division, when I think a lot of people thought that would be the case. But you asked the question about, about principles. I know that for Labor to get elected at the next election, we have to say what we mean and mean what we say. Well, there is no shortcut. I think this is going to be the greatest conundrum or problem that the Liberals face. Are they a party of the centre or are they a party of the right? And no issue illustrates that more clearly, I believe, than climate change and emissions trading scheme. One thing I admired about Malcolm Turnbull when he was leader of the opposition, he said he didn't want to lead a party which wasn't fair income on climate change. I don't think he used those precise words, but that was the sense of what he meant. And that involved having an emissions trading scheme, letting the market set a price on carbon pollution. Now, when we asked him questions about this in Parliament, he's changed his tune. That'll be up for Malcolm Turnbull and for Australians to work out if they're satisfied with that. But for Labor on climate change, we've made it very clear, and we made it clear when Tony Abbott was full of his carbon tax rhetoric when he was Prime Minister. We've made it very clear we want to put a price on it. We'll have an emissions trading scheme. We're going to push for 50% renewable energy by 2030 as part of our energy mix. Labor can't afford to backflip on its core policies, and we won't.
Now, I'm going to just press you on part of the question that was about you, that you avoided, essentially. And the principle talked about here could be loyalty to the leader that you helped install in this Rudd-Gillard-Rudd fiasco that was mentioned there. Do you think people are confused about you and your loyalty because of your role in two coups? The coup to put Julia Gillard in, the coup to take her out.
Well, as I said earlier in answer to the question, so I didn't really think I was avoiding it, that was very difficult. Labor believed, a lot of people in Labor believed that the government had lost its way, and we thought that Julia Gillard would do a better job. And then much more recently, when it was clear that Labor was heading for a very big defeat, there was a view which formed that Kevin Rudd would at least help save the furniture, which he did. But what Labor learned from that, what we did learn from that, all of us, every party member, every member of the parliamentary party, is that you can't treat this as business as usual and that politics is all just about the next opinion poll. That would be a mistake. So now I've watched the Liberals do exactly what we did. They've done exactly what we've done. The difference is that the Labor Party has learned, and we're two different things to what happened then. One, we are much more united, and two, we introduced rules which make it a lot harder to do. So we know what we've got to do. We've got to be united. That's the sort of initial thing that Labor has to do. Then we've got to develop policies, and that's what we've been doing this year. And along the way, I think we've been a very strong opposition to Tony Abbott. The opposition, we're still here, and Mr Abbott's gone.
Okay, we're going to go to another question, again related to what we've been talking about. It's from Mary Hollick.
With the end of Australia's failed experiment with US-style Tea Party politics and the government and opposition now offering more centrist policies, could you, Mr Shorten, specify which issues you would work with the government on to arrive at consensus for the good of the nation?
Yes, I can actually, and I think that's a really important question, Mary, because whilst there'll be things that we disagree on, I agree, and we've said when Joe Hockey brought down his second budget, that the future of Australia's economy needed to be based around science and technology. It would appear that the government, the Liberals, are now saying the same thing, so we'll work together on that. One issue which I think we can work together on is climate change. I do believe that we need to encourage the government to have a renewable energy future, to perhaps be bolder than their current policies on tackling climate change. Now, what Malcolm Turnbull was in opposition is he worked with the government of the day, Mr Rudd, on climate change, and then his own party tore him down. I can make this promise to Mr Turnbull that if he wants to go back and be fair income on climate change, my party will back it. You know, in some ways, my job's easier on climate change than Malcolm Turnbull's. My party believes in it. So there's climate change we can work together. Another issue I'd like to work together is the issue of domestic violence. In Mr Abbott's last week, the week before, 3 women were killed by former partners who once upon a time said they loved them. Now, I don't think we need to wait to an election to really tackle domestic violence. I'd also like to say, through this audience to Australians, that we could work with Mr Turnbull on marriage equality. We're happy to have a conscience vote right now. We don't need to have an ongoing debate over the next number of years to have a taxpayer-funded opinion poll of $160 million, which we know was designed by Tony Abbott to delay marriage equality. Let's just have a conscience vote. Let's just do it. If there's not a majority in the parliament to do it, so be it. At least we've found that out and we don't have to spend $160 million. So marriage equality, climate change, domestic violence, we can work with Mr Turnbull, and also the priority of science and research. That's something Labor fundamentally believes in our DNA.
All right, you're watching Q&A, where we encourage political leaders to express their opinions, but stick to the facts. So if you hear any dodgy claims on Q&A tonight, tip us off with a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and to keep an eye on our Twitter account for those fact checks. Well, the next question comes from Jim Liaskos.
Integrity is always a key attribute for any Prime Minister. With your involvement in the downfall of 2 former Prime Ministers, the stench of the Health Services Union, the CFMEU, and unanswered questions from the Royal Commission, colouring your years as a key player in the union movement here in Australia, does the high standard your party has set in regard to perceptions about Royal Commissioner Hayden mean that your leadership is likewise damaged, or is there a different standard for potential Prime Ministers?
There's a few assumptions in your question which I'm going to take issue with. I mean, we're not here just to agree with each other for the sake of it. The Royal Commission was set up by Tony Abbott to go after his political rivals. If you want to deal with issues of criminal behaviour in the workplace, then we use the police, and there's measures we can do there. In terms of the Royal Commissioner, who saw nothing wrong with attending Liberal Party events whilst he's hearing matters investigating the political rivals of the Liberal Party, that just doesn't pass the common sense test. But when it goes to, I think, the broader issues about integrity and change in leadership, what Australians want is they want to focus on the policies. What I can promise people here and now is that when we commit to a policy, that's what you're going to get. And what I can also commit to Australians is that when we talk about issues at the highest possible standards, the Labor Party is committed to maintaining those standards.
Okay, now look, the question referred to unanswered questions from the Royal Commission. One of them is whether you demanded side payments for the AWU to the AWU from employers while you were negotiating EBUs on behalf of workers. Did you do that?
Well, actually, there's 2 points you just made there. The gentleman did say unanswered questions. I answered over 900 questions of that Royal Commission.
Did you answer that one?
Yes, but I'm just going to the point.
So what's the answer now?
Well, Tony, you make a serious issue, so I'm going to treat your question with the seriousness that I actually think you expect.
You do.
So the first thing is, over 900 questions asked to the opposition leader, yet when you look at how the Royal Commission has managed to ignore other people who've gone there and asked them far less diligent questioning, and indeed was helping prepare witnesses they like to answer questions, I don't think this Royal Commission has been a level playing field. But going to your specific question, the answer is no, I didn't.
Okay, so 2005, a deal was struck with Tees John Holland to pay the AWU $100,000 a year for 3 years during the course of the giant Eastlink project. Did you negotiate for that $100,000 to be paid each year to the AWU?
The Eastlink project that Tony's referring to was the single largest civil construction project that had been built in Australia. It was worth something like $3 billion in terms of the cost to taxpayers. I negotiated an agreement which saw the best payment of construction pay rates to construction workers ever negotiated in Australia. As part of that, I have a philosophy. I had a philosophy then and I still have a philosophy now. The workplace relations doesn't have to just be us versus them, the bosses versus the workers. Now, sometimes there is conflict and you've got to be willing to, represent your corner or your group as strongly as you can. But I believe that the Eastlink project, which saw not a single worker seriously injured, which saw the best pay rates and saw taxpayers' money being well spent and finished ahead of time, was a good deal. In terms of the relationship of the company working with the union, There's been an argument put somewhat bizarrely by some Conservative commentators that a company and a union having shared interests is something to be suspicious of. Now, I don't have that view. So it is correct that when we negotiated with this company on behalf of our members, we would also ask the company to train our delegates in health and safety, that we would also ask our company to release workplace delegates to be able to learn more about how to do their jobs and resolve matters.
Okay,
so
but
certainly
specifically,
that's the case.
because it can't be magic that each year for 3 years they gave the union $100,000.
Well,
so there must have been a deal, a quid pro quo deal, where you do this, we do that.
so our point about all of this, working with companies and working with the construction companies and other companies, is this. We think that workplace relations works best when a union is making sure that our delegates and workplace reps are well trained. So certainly we would charge the company money for the training of our representatives so they could do their job
Yes,
better
but
on
did
the
you
side.
strike
No,
that
but there was
deal?
no...
But did you strike that deal while you were negotiating the EBA? That's the critical question, because people wonder whether that's a conflict of interest, asking for money for the union while simultaneously negotiating a pay and conditions deal with the company.
My first priority at all times, as it is with our union reps generally, is to get the best deal for your members. In addition, we also would work with the company to make sure that they provided training to the union reps so that they could do their job very well. This has been the case well before that project and well after.
I'm going to interrupt you there again. So was there a specific deal to give the union $100,000 a year for 3 years? And was that deal made during the negotiations for the EBU?
Well, the answer, sorry, I thought I'd said that earlier, but sorry, the answer is no. The arrangement which is entered into quite often is that the union will ask the company to help pay for the training of their workers with time off and the payment of training services, and we certainly did that, yes. But in terms of a specific arrangement to somehow do a worse deal for your members, absolutely not, categorically not.
Okay, the next question is from Bruce King.
Bill, I love that word integrity, by the way, something I live by. Bill, the EBA agreement you made with Clean Event was well under the Fair Work Australia award conditions, including weekend penalty rates, which I thought Fair Work was there to save people from that. This placed other contractors trying to compete for the same work in a bad position. Will this practice go on to other awards, such as retail or even maybe hospitality?
Well, there's an assumption in your question which isn't quite correct. In terms of negotiations done by unions, they have to get their agreements, certainly under most of the time, most of the laws except for Tony Abbott's work choice laws, have to be approved by the members, they have to be voted upon, and secondly, they have to pass the various no disadvantage tests which are put forward by the industrial relations law. And specifically in the case of Clean Event and arrangements which I'm involved in, we made sure that people were paid properly. Anyone who's ever worked in event cleaning, or if you've ever seen the cleaning at the end of the day at a racetrack or a dog track or the shows, knows there's a lot of fly-by-night contractors. So the assumption that this agreement was disadvantaging unscrupulous contractors is not correct. In terms of the extension to retail and other awards, the way in which penalty rates are negotiated is either through enterprise bargaining or through the award system. And that's been the case for a long while, and Labor's certainly very sceptical of proposals to simply get rid of the safety net which exists to protect people.
Just going to quickly, just quickly go back to our question because he threw his hand up there. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bill, once again, we talk integrity here. As far as the voting goes on that award, those members were signed up without even knowing, so I don't know how they can vote on an award when it's that case. And it's my belief you only need a certain number of people to do that vote. So I have been involved with event cleanup. In fact, I was involved with Skilled Stadium, and I know that mob Clean Event come in to take over that contract, which also took away local Geelong jobs because they all come down from Melbourne to do that job.
Keep it brief if you can, Bruce. Okay, thank you very much. You want to respond to that?
Well, in terms of voting, agreements have a process to go through, and at no stage has any argument been led with any evidence that that process isn't pursued.
Okay, let's go to next question. It's from Veronica Levy.
Opposition Leader Shorten, If you receive an adverse finding from the Trade Union Royal Commission, will you immediately resign as leader and allow Anthony Albanese to take Labor to the next election?
In terms of the Royal Commission and its findings, I said a bit earlier, and I'm trying to move through questions so people get the chance to ask as many questions as possible, but I want to come back and look at this Royal Commission again. I'll just state some facts here. The Royal Commission, in my opinion, was set up for a range of motives. On one hand, it's to look at particular arrangements in the construction industry, and also I believe it was set up to smear its political rivals. So I do not believe automatically that because the Royal Commissioner, if, and you stressed it was a hypothetical question, if they're to make an adverse finding, no, I don't accept that automatically I'm going to allow that Royal Commission to, which is set up on a political basis, to start dictating what the Labor Party does or how we run our politics in this country. If there is criminality found by this Royal Commission, well then that's a matter which needs to be looked at. But I don't accept that everything that this Royal Commission's doing is started with the best of motivations, nor do I believe that this process has been entirely fair.
Let me, a quick follow-up on that. What happens if former company reps like Stephen Sass from Tees, John Holland, come forward and give evidence to the Royal Commission which contradicts what you have said about what happened in those behind closed doors negotiations?
Well, that won't be correct then. But again, you're talking about a hypothetical. Listen, I'm very happy with the record I have for looking after workers in Australia and the workers I represented. Now, we've spoken about a couple of agreements. I probably signed off on 700 agreements in my time. I know that we lifted the wages faster than the inflation rate for workers. I know that we made workplaces safer. I know that from time to time we'd have to make decisions to make sure that people were able to work cooperatively with their management, and we would always give people a voice in what was happening. So I stand by my record. At the same time, I was representing, along with hundreds of other people, workers in Australia in the union movement. We had a Liberal government winding back conditions for workers, for millions of workers, taking away the safety net. You know, labour relations has always been a controversial area where there are strong views. But one thing I will not do is allow a Royal Commission or a Conservative government to undermine the safety net for Australian workers. You know, if we want to see what the world looks like, if you want to take away the capacity of unions to represent workers, have a look at 7-Eleven. You know, these are not issues of the last century. When people say that unions no longer have a role in Australian society, well, I say they don't quite understand the nature of our democratic society. I am proud of being a trade union representative. I am proud of my record, and I'll contrast standing up for literally thousands of workers against Mr Abbott's record or Mr Turnbull's record. At the time I'm negotiating for cleaners or representing construction workers, these gentlemen were sitting at the cabinet table of John Howard, voting to take away conditions en masse from millions of Australians.
Okay, quick follow-up on the Royal Commission. Are you suggesting that Dyson Heydon, because of the fundraising, Liberal fundraising scandal, will not have any findings which you will accept?
No, I'm not saying that, but I've been asked two hypothetical questions in a row.
I'm just asking you about that because you were talking about the Royal Commission being political. Obviously, the fundraising issue fed into that. Are you going to accept anything the Royal Commissioner says?
Well, I put two caveats on what I said. One is if there's criminal matters, well, no one's got any tolerance for that in the Labor Party. No one has said to me in the Labor Party. No one's come forward to me from the union movement and said that if someone's found to have broken the law, to behaved in a criminal fashion, no one's saying they shouldn't be charged. No one's saying that they shouldn't feel the full consequences of the law.
But I'm talking about if he makes adverse findings against you, which are not necessarily criminal.
Okay, that's a different question you're asking. The first question you're saying is if Dyson Heydon made any findings, are you saying automatically we put them all in the bin and ignore them? No.
Let's stick with the findings about
but then then you asked that latter question. You said, what about yourself? I know what I've done. I know that I've stood up for workers. I know that I've been happy to accept scrutiny for what I do. I offer myself for the highest position in the land in our democracy. So I accept scrutiny. But what I don't accept is that it's worth $60 million to second guess whether or not you pay someone a casual rate or a penalty rate on a Sunday and have every sort of industrial negotiation second guessed by barristers who are paid $3.5 million. It's nonsense. You know, it's all very well, everyone says, oh, it's a Royal Commission, therefore everything it does must be respectable. That is not true. A Royal Commission is not a court. It's an extension of the executive government of Australia. I don't believe it is the best use of $63 million to investigate gossip and innuendo when in fact there are other mechanisms to investigate criminality. I don't buy that. I imagine what could have been done with those tens of millions of dollars. I don't accept the counsel assisting who gets to ask questions, who's paid $3.5 million of your money to ask questions. I actually don't think that is the best use of taxpayer money. And yes, Tony, I do think the Royal Commission is politically motivated. And so I'm not going to simply just give up and say, oh, well, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. I don't buy that.
Okay, you're watching... Thank you. Thank you very much. You're watching Q&A live from Ballarat with the opposition leader, Bill Short. The next question comes from Lisanne Doyle.
Having lived in the Latrobe Valley for 15 years, from 1985 to 2000, I experienced firsthand the negative effect the unions had on that economy. I'm now seeing within the Victorian economy, under the Labor government, an increase in the number of strikes and industrial disputes. This suggests to me that the unions seem to have a freedom under Labor where they can easily gain the upper hand. Please give me one good reason, Mr Shorten, why I should not be afraid for Australia's economy should Labor win the next federal election.
If you lived in the Latrobe Valley, I think you said, between 1985 and 2000, for people not from Victoria, that's in sort of central West Gippsland. It was a powerhouse region of the economy. Sir John Monash was put in charge of setting up the State Electricity Commission after the First World War. So it's not dissimilar to the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, for instance. It was a coal mining province. I mean, it's much more than that, but that was certainly the State Electricity Commission. But if you lived there between 1985 and 2000, it wasn't industrial relations which caused the dislocation of the Latrobe Valley. It was Jeff Kennett privatising the SEC, and thousands of people lost their jobs. Now, I do not condone every form of industrial militancy. I was a moderate union leader. You know, we were talking about earlier working with Eastlink, this construction project. I was determined that you can have good industrial relations. I don't agree with every wildcat strike. I've had more arguments, I suspect, with the militant elements of the trade union movement than probably anyone in this room. Because I believe that industrial relations works best when there's cooperation. You should never be afraid to have a disagreement, but you should never be in fear of negotiating either. So when you talk about your concern about unions in Victoria, I also have to say this. Industrial disputation in this country is far down on what it was in the 1980s in the Latrobe Valley. Productivity, unfortunately, is down even though there's less industrial action. What concerns me in this country isn't that the 12% of Australians in the private sector who belong to unions are about to take over the country. What concerns me is that real income growth in this country is flatlining. See, what we actually need in this country is a new discussion about workplace relations. Yes, there have been times when unions have done the wrong thing. And yes, there have been times when employers have done the wrong thing. But the truth of the matter is that those examples of workplace relations don't describe, in my opinion, 95% of people's experience going to work. So I do believe in a strong safety net. And if you believe in a strong safety net at work, you're more likely to vote Labor than Liberal. That's the truth of the matter. Because Mr Abbott, Mr Turnbull and the rest of them, I've never really heard them get excited about lifting the minimum wage in this country. They keep voting against lifting compulsory superannuation. You know, the compact in this country, what makes the Australian economic story so special is we don't have vast disparities of the working poor, like you see in perhaps the United States, and the super rich. We do have a good safety net. So I want to reassure you, because you asked, give you a reason, the future of work in this country, the future of economic growth in this country, a better future is not going to be determined by a scare campaign about trade unions, which has a lot more to do with what happened 30 years ago than it does today. What will make Australians better off in the future is a proper education system, is a decent safety net of health care and wages, is a commitment to innovation.
Let's move on.
Don't worry about the unions.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we will move on to
Sure.
some of those issues. And the next question comes from Jean Flynn.
2 years ago, I stood in the hail with my 2 children and a group of other protesters to show the then Premier, Denis Snapthine, that we gave a Gonski. But do you think that allocating government funding for education according to individual student needs is enough, or should Australia look to Finland for inspiration and do away with private schools altogether?
Thank you for standing up 2 years ago with your kids. It's one of the great broken promises of this Liberal government. Before the last election, for all the difficulties Labor had through its division, there was one issue time and time again people rated Labor better than Liberal on. It was proper funding of schools according to need. Now, you referred to the Gonski campaign. That's named after the chap who chaired a review set up by Julia Gillard to talk about what should the future of schools funding be. And we came back with an answer which I support. It's individual needs-based funding. So schools should be funded based upon a series of criteria, and it's a bit more scientific, but to save time, I'll just go through what the needs-based funding that Labor has always supported. You know, is the school in a low-income area? Does it have a lot of, for instance, children from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander background? Is it a small school? Does it take children with disabilities? These were some of the criteria. I like that needs-based funding because traditionally what's happened in education over the last 40 years is the Commonwealth's funded private schools and the states have been left to fund government schools. Now, I think that private government debate is not the right debate to have. So I'd just disappoint you a bit slightly with your second part of your question. For me, I'm not fussed about private and government. I'm fussed about needs-based funding. Now, I think, though, that there's a lot from Finland and its education that we can learn from. And one of the key things is the central role of teachers. Supporting our teachers, making sure they're getting the best quality training, making sure they're given respect in society and they're paid properly. I think Finland has plenty to teach us about that. What annoys me a little bit about 2 years ago is both the Liberal and Labor said that we would fund according to need, but the Liberals have backslid ever since on needs-based funding in schools. So I can promise you, Labor will do needs-based funding in the schools. That will be our policy at the next election. Kate Ellis, my shadow spokesperson, others, we're finalising our approach. Labor is still committed to the principles which you stood in the hail for, and at the next election, I have to say, if the Liberals say they're on a unity ticket with us, Christopher Pyne and the rest of them, they didn't do it last time, so why do we think they'd change next time?
Very briefly, have you figured out how to pay for it yet? And will you tell the public how you're going to do that, along with the increased cost of the NDIS, along with the increased cost of healthcare, in particular hospital care, which is requiring billions of dollars of new funds?
So I'm just making a note, healthcare, NDIS and schools. You're right, Tony, it isn't easy. It's not straightforward. Because in the last 2 years, the current government have doubled the deficit. I think they promised 2 years ago that they'd be a government of adults. Now we've got a new government of adults to replace the last group of adults. But in terms of the budget position, we're going to need a bigger discussion over the next number of months about what the true numbers are, because I don't think the government's been straight with us. But yes, we will have costed policies for the next election. Now on the NDIS...
Will they include tax increases?
Well, just try and... I know
inevitably they'll have to, won't they?
I know you want me to move me along with your first question, but just on the National Disability Insurance Scheme in particular, I just want to... You mentioned it, I just want to come to it. I'm disappointed the new Prime Minister hasn't made a Minister for Disabilities. I think that is important because the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a real reform which will provide packages of support to families with family members of severe and profound disabilities. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is already paid for in the budget. So when we talk about healthcare and schools, I don't want to see NDIS automatically lumped into that because that is paid for already in the existing budget.
Well, for the next 3 years, that's true. And beyond that, it gets much more expensive, and so does everything else.
Well, just on the National Disability Insurance
So,
again.
but we'll come to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There are questions on it later, but the real question is, are you going to raise taxes in order to pay for all these promises?
Well, we have proposed that there are taxes which can be raised. So, yes. But what I say is that the first two which we've looked at involve dialling back the excessive loopholes in superannuation tax concessions, which currently the very, very, very well-off enjoy. I mean, if you've got a couple of $1 million in superannuation and you've got an income stream of interest of a couple of $100,000, I don't see why that should all be tax-free income when someone else is going to work earning far less still pays more tax. So yes, we are interested to clamp down on some of the loopholes at the top end of superannuation. And also there's more taxes we think can be raised for multinationals who do business in Australia.
Okay. Let's make the point, we may come back to this later, but none of the things you've talked about there are going to pay for the huge deficit in funding which we're talking about. But let's move on, because we've got a question on, effectively on tertiary education from Anne Said.
Hi, I am a teacher, and since the coalition government proposed the deregulation of tertiary education, I've been in the unfortunate position of having to speak to some of the kids that this is going to affect in a real way very shortly, or they're afraid it is. So I've had to counsel them and console them and try and reassure them that things will be okay. But they're really, really concerned that, a number of them are concerned that they will no longer be able to afford a tertiary education. And they're great kids. They're talented, they're enthusiastic, they're hardworking, they're astonishing, and they've got so much to offer the country if they can get their foot in the door. And so on their behalf, my question is, what are you going to do to make sure that our tertiary system remains fair, affordable and merit-based?
I'm going to cut that too. Labor has been really strongly opposed to what the Liberal government have proposed in higher education. In a nutshell, I mean, before the last election, the Liberal opposition said there'd be no changes. And then after the election, surprise, surprise, they've decided to cut 20% from university funding and fully deregulate the price setting by universities. I think this has been a disastrous proposition for universities. On one hand, you take 20% out of university funding. Federation University, right here, would lose $52 million. Okay, the problem is if you take 20% away from universities, what are they going to do to recover that loss? Charge students more. And that's the deregulation. Now, I always understood that deregulation was positive, where it would increase competition and decrease prices. This would have the exact opposite effect. So today, Labor announced our policy for higher education. We've decided that with some of the money we would raise from multinational taxation and superannuation loopholes, that we would commit to put a floor, and that's an F-L-O-O-R, in university funding, and that would be more generous than what the Liberals are proposing. So we've proposed to basically take away the 20% cuts that the Libs are doing and restore it to as it was. What that means is that universities don't have the same pressure to increase prices. So the first part of my answer to your question is that Labor will, you tell a government and a political party by the choices they make. We have decided that if this country's to have a bright future, we need to have people being able to go to university from all backgrounds. So we've decided that we will find the money in a difficult economic circumstance, as Tony said, and that's just our priority. See, one thing I don't think this government understands about young people, and indeed not so young people who want to go to university, is that young people today have to pay 9.5% into super. They've got to pay their HECS debt. The only way most young people can hope to get a house is if they inherited from their parents. And now the Liberals want to put a GST on and they want to charge you more to go to university. The answer in Australia is not always to increase the price of everything. In terms of the equity, we've made it very clear that in return for providing guaranteed funding We expect the universities, and we'll sit down and work it through with them, to have equity as one of their criteria. I want to see more mature age students who are brave enough to seek to change their career, to be able to do it without being discouraged by higher prices. We want to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids who currently don't get the same access get more access to higher education. There's a 6% gap in completion between kids from regional Australia and metropolitan Australia. We think that's an important gap to bridge, and we're asking our universities to focus on quality, on improving completion rates, and of course to prioritise support for teaching in universities. It's a good equity platform on higher education.
Okay, thank you. Let's change tack again. Our next question comes from Wayne Harbour.
Mr. Shorten, the Ballarat Botanical Gardens have a fine avenue containing 27 bronze portraits of every Australian Prime Minister.
Oh, yeah.
The last bust unveiled being that of Julia Gillard. However, the bequest has run out of money and there's insufficient funds for additional busts. If you're elected Prime Minister, will you allocate funds to allow Tony Abbott's bust to be cast and placed on the avenue, looking into Julia Gillard's eyes and standing to the left of Kevin Rudd?
Oh, my word.
Well, you shouldn't
Do
you?
I take that as a comment? Absolutely. Let's not wait till the next election to do that. I'll ask Malcolm. I think he'd probably be up for funding it anyway.
I suspect he'll have the first option to fund that. Now, the next question is from Andrew Young.
As a regional development consultant working with a number of regional development businesses who are awaiting the signing of the CHAFTA agreement, those businesses collectively will be looking at over $100 million of new investment and 400 new jobs. You're telling us that we need to change that agreement because somehow those businesses...
Let's just make it clear to everyone watching. No, sorry. That you're talking about the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
So what I'm hearing from the Labor Party and yourself is that somehow these businesses are going to be obliged to employ Chinese workers in these regional businesses. There's a lot of confusion. They're sitting on this money waiting to invest, and so are the regional communities that they represent with new jobs. I'm interested in your view, please.
Thanks, Andrew. When I say thank you for that question, I really mean it because the debate... Oh, I meant it every other time for every other question too. But in the case of the China Free Trade Agreement, it's a really important public policy debate. So it's a chance for me just to spell out what Labor thinks. We support having a China Free Trade Agreement, so that's good. Our position has been misrepresented in parts of the media and, not surprisingly, by elements in the government. The treaty has been negotiated. The idea that we expect our negotiators to go back to China and vary the actual terms of the treaty is not what we're saying. The only proposition, and it's a pretty reasonable proposition, I hope you'd agree once I go through it, is that we are concerned that there are matters arising from the treaty which need to be belt and braced, and I'm talking about the use of temporary labour coming into Australia, and that there should be appropriate safeguards around that. Now, when I talk about appropriate safeguards, with the previous Prime Minister, negotiating with him, frankly, was a waste of time. Once they had decided there was a political game to play here, I couldn't get them to negotiate. I've already raised with Malcolm Turnbull that we need to talk about the legitimate concerns which have been raised, and the concerns are very simple, they're three.
Have you got a compromise position though? Because
of course.
There are a number of people here who asked about this, and people want to know in this region and in other parts of the country when Labor will sign the agreement, when Labor will vote to allow the agreement through the Senate.
Well, the agreement doesn't come to the Senate. There's enabling legislation which deals with some of the administrative matters arising from it. Labor's position's very straightforward. For projects over $150 million, there's been an arrangement entered into, not in the actual treaty, but in related matters, which would say if there's an investor who's putting in more than $150 million, they can bring people in from China to do the jobs on it. Now, our view is that they should ask and ensure that Australians who could do the work get first crack at the work. That is not an unreasonable proposition. And that is what exists in other free trade agreements.
And Andrew Robb consistently says the conditions under which Chinese workers or other foreign workers could come into the country under this agreement are exactly the same as Labor has agreed to in the past.
Well, I thought you'd raise that. I've got here the Korean agreement, the Malaysian agreement, the Chile agreement and the ASEAN NZ agreement, New Zealand agreement. They all do have different conditions to the China agreement. But be that as it may, but it is not a template of other free trade agreements. This $150 million clause has not been in other trade agreements. Furthermore, we would just like them to do labour market testing. We just want to be satisfied that if we're going to do a trade agreement, that Australians, not just some Australians, but Australians, all Australians can get a benefit from it. Now, this is not a deal killer. It doesn't involve changing the treaty. I'm optimistic that there is a compromise, as you say. So, I don't think this will be the concerns which you, Andrew,
Can you
raising.
guarantee to business people like that and others in the audience who are waiting for this agreement to be signed and ratified so they can go ahead and make these investments, can you guarantee this won't be allowed to drag on until the next election, simply because it makes a good election issue?
Well, I certainly don't think it should drag on to the next election. Just for the record, the government only presented the legislation last week. So, and they know that there's been a Senate inquiry set up to review, and there's a joint committee of Parliament reviewing the circumstances and the detail of the arrangements. And so there hasn't been any undue delay.
So how quickly do you reckon it could be resolved?
As soon as the Liberal Party just sit down and work through our concerns. Like, I'm not running for the Liberal Party. It's not my job to be a rubber stamp for Tony Abbott. Imagine if every time the Liberal Party of Australia said you must do as we say, you'd have a GP tax, your pensions would have been cut, you'd have $100,000 degrees. But don't get me wrong, Labor has always, when it's been unfashionable, supported developing our links with China, from Gough Whitlam through to Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. Now, a lot of people say, the 1980s was when all the good reform was happening, that's when Labor was, doing all reforms. Well, the point is, at the same time that we were floating the dollar, same time as we were creating independent monetary policy through the Reserve Bank, it was Labor who was saying, and we want a strong minimum wage, and we want to introduce compulsory superannuation, and we want to have Medicare. It's now our turn to step up to the plate for reform.
Okay.
I'm on board for a China. No, this is a really important.
Okay, briefly, go ahead.
But only because you said so many businesses are interested. I'm up for reform. We are up for a China free trade agreement. I just want to make sure that some Australians don't get done over when there's a simple administrative remedy available. If the government says there's nothing to fear from this arrangement, then our compromises will be very easy to agree to.
So can you guarantee it won't go through to the next election?
I certainly believe that with the change in leadership in the Liberal Party, the chances of having an intelligent discussion and negotiation, I certainly hope they've improved, okay?
All right, let's move on. Our next question, thank you. Very little time. Our next question comes from Brendan Johnston.
Mr Shorten, as a secondary school teacher, I've observed continuous cutbacks to youth services, especially in employment training and BCAL programs.
Yeah.
With Ballarat's youth unemployment currently at over 20%, if you are trusted by the Australian electorate to become Prime Minister, what will your government do to the youth unemployment in regional communities like Ballarat?
That's a good question. First of all, you talk about cutbacks in the school system. Only Labor's going to have policies to deal with needs-based education, which will improve your task as a secondary teacher and the people you can help. Secondly, what we've got to do is have, I think there's been too much when it comes to TAFE, trust in private providers. The pendulum has swung too far in favour of private providers. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are good private providers of training in this country. There are excellent, outstanding providers. But I want to go and restore funding to TAFE, because I think that if kids are getting the best opportunities in terms of their trades qualifications, that gives kids who go through the VCAL stream the best chances in life. I think the other thing we can do is we can also make sure that there's more jobs being created. And how do you create more jobs? You do it through not just relying upon mining and not just relying on financial services, but making sure that we have manufacturing, One of the big challenges in Ballarat, and I know that Rivers shed 100 people last week, we've seen the car components industry hit, is you start backing in manufacturing. The way you back in manufacturing, you get behind climate change and renewable energy. There's a lot of car component makers who could start making solar products. We need the government of Australia, the Liberal government of Australia, to drop its unreasonable, unscientific, really stupid anti-renewable energy policies, and then we can create some more manufacturing jobs.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Another question on a different subject from Jason Taylor.
Within the regional Victorian city of Bendigo in recent weeks, we have seen violence and racism shut down the CBD for an anti-immigration rally against the building of a mosque in Bendigo. As a local and as a Bendigo business owner, I feel this is both harmful to our community, our local economy, and our reputation as a diverse and inclusive city. With the success of the resettlement of Karen refugees in rural Victoria and the discussion of resettling 12,000 refugees in Syria, how do we as a regional community remain confident that our nation's message of inclusion and diversity is echoed through our regional cities and businesses?
Try and keep it brief.
All right. I've been appalled at some of the protests against the mosque, and no doubt that'll trigger some hate mail from parts of Australia for me saying it. All I say to people who are intolerant of others' religion, just remember where you came from. My mum grew up in Ballarat. She grew up in the late 40s, early 50s. She got knocked back for a job in a supermarket here because she was Catholic. All I say is that when we start treating minorities poorly, then remember, whatever majority you can turn into a minority. This is an immigrant nation. Other than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we all came from somewhere else. The first of my ancestors came here looking for gold. They didn't find any. So the others got here as convicts. You know, the point about it is intolerance demeans us all, and I really admire all those citizens of Bendigo and the small businesses who've said that, you know what, let's have a bit of tolerance for diversity. You should be very proud of what you and others have been doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You're watching Q&A. We're live from Ballarat. The next question comes from Joanne Kermond.
My family have been forced out of our home by intrusive sound waves proven by acoustician Steve Cooper to come from nearby wind turbines at Cape Bridgewater. Many others have had to abandon their homes. There is no compensation, just cruel denial. My husband and I live in a battered old bus. Our children have been unable to stay with us. Is this fair? And why does the ABC love these dangerous and unsafe machines so much?
Bill Shorten, you don't have to answer the ABC part of it, or you can attempt to if you like, but that's the other side of the renewable energy story as far as some people is concerned.
I am sorry that you are in the difficulties that you and your family are in. But I don't agree with the general view that wind farms are, as I think you said, dangerous and by implication very bad. I think that wind energy is proven around the world in terms of delivering jobs, more climate-friendly energy and income for farmers who have them on their properties. I'm not going to tell you that what you're going through is good or right for you, but I don't believe that our wind farms are causing the sort of collective menace which you and other sceptics of wind farms believe they are.
Just for the record, I don't think the ABC has a specific policy on wind farms, although there is an awful lot of hot air generated in some of our studios, that is true. Next question is from James Hogben.
Mr. Shorten, 161 years ago, the seed for a republic in Australia was sown. When a person turns 21, they get the keys to the house. Do you think it's time that the Australian people got the keys to Government House and had the option of directly electing their head of state? Thank you.
He was talking about Eureka Stockade, obviously.
Oh, no, some of my family helped hide Peter Lawler when he was on the run. So, yes, I think we should become a republic. I think in 2020, it'll be 250 years since Captain Cook made first landfall in Australia. In that time, we are ready. We are ready to have an Australian head of state. I take nothing away from the Queen and her service. It's incredibly distinguished. But, you know, we've got Asia rising. We're an independent nation. I actually think constitutional reform would give this country more sort of lifeblood energy when we deal with the rest of the world. So yes, I do think we should become a republic. I'm looking forward to having discussions with Malcolm Turnbull about that. He said that it's not the most important issue. I think Australians are capable of doing more than one thing at a time. In terms of your second part of your question or observation about direct election, I'm not sold on that yet. I think the first thing that we need to do...
You say you're not sold on it. Do you oppose the model specifically? Because that was the model that the vast majority of Australians wanted at the last referendum, according to opinion polls.
Yeah, I see some of the case for it in that how do you select people, and I'd rather have it people being more involved in the decision than just members of parliament. But I think there are issues around how do you avoid it becoming some sort of, you know, celebrity survivor-like contest, and the fact that Donald Trump could be anywhere near becoming president of America, goodness me. So,
are you equating the Republican candidates to survivors?
Oh. Now, for the sake of foreign relations, I'll let people work out what they think. But I do think, you know, your point does contain a grain of what I think Australians are concerned about. I think that Australians want to see more from their politicians and their media about debates. Now, I include myself in that. I include you in that too. I think what people are looking for is more depth of argument. So, on an issue like the Republic, it's not simple, but I do think that what we need is leadership. You know, I think that in the next 5 years, well, first of all, we should set up a constitutional commission so that Australians learn more about their constitution. This argument that it was written, drafted in the 1890s and can never be changed, I don't buy that argument.
Okay, well, our questioner has got his hand up again.
Mr. Shorten, with all due respect, the politicians have tried to have leaders, 5 leaders, in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
If we're going to have a president or a Governor-General that's elected by the people, I think we can do a better job than what politicians have done in the last 5 years.
Okay.
Hang on. No, there's an obvious rejoinder. Come on.
I'm going to take that as a comment.
I take it as a comment. I tell you, the same people also vote for us, and thank you. Okay.
Okay, the next question is from Luke Garn.
Yeah, the front page of this morning's Brisbane Courier Mail had the headline "Ride with Mal," announcing Turnbull's plan to free up hundreds of millions of dollars for public transport projects. Here in Ballarat, our train has gone off the tracks. Will a Labor federal government join Turnbull in prioritising public transport, particularly here in the regions?
Short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer is Labor went to the last election with a public transport policy. We haven't had the sort of fatwa against public transport that the Liberals have had for the last 2 years. I'll tell you now, I think in the next 5 years work should start on Cross River Rail in Brisbane, work on a railway link for Badgerys Airport in Sydney. I think Melbourne should have, and Victoria should have, a metro, a Melbourne metro. I also think South Australia, Adelaide should have light rail. I think Western Australia and Perth should have a Perth Metro rail plan. In terms of public transport infrastructure, one thing Mr Turnbull could do is it's good to catch the train. But what's more important is reverse the $4.5 billion worth of cuts that they took away from public transport infrastructure. So we back it. Don't worry about that. We're the public transport party, and we're looking forward to Mr Turnbull converting the Liberals into being a little more pro-public transport than they've been for the last 2 years.
Just very briefly, you didn't mention high-speed rail, which of course is Anthony Albanese's baby. Are you going to back that as well?
We support funding the feasibility study, having a look at how it works. 10 years ago, I wrote that Australia needed an inland railway tracking up the western side of the dividing ranges. But the reason why I spoke about that public transport infrastructure in the big cities is there's $4.5 billion, which the current Liberal government have cut. If you really believe in public transport, rather than just social media memes, What we need to do is see some of that money come back into public transport. And if Malcolm Turnbull wants to do it, we'll work with him. That's our promise.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. We're running out of time, guys, so save your applause for later. It's from Denise Fitzpatrick.
40% of the workforce, or 5 million Australian jobs, are at risk of being taken over by computers in the next 10 to 15 years. Climate change will bring significant challenges to our economy. When Malcolm Turnbull took over the leadership of the Liberal Party and the country last week, he articulated a positive vision for Australia, but stated our need to be agile and to take advantage of the opportunities this new century brings. Mr. Shorten, what are the fundamental changes that you think will need to be made for us to take advantage of the opportunities that these changes are going to bring?
Thanks, Denise. 5 things I think we could do. Got to make sure our education system's working well. Got to make sure we have needs-based funding in our schools, that we get TAFE having its funding restored, that we have higher education properly funded, not this deregulation which the current government's been proposing. So education's one. I mentioned infrastructure earlier tonight, public transport. I think if we become a nation who can make generational decisions on our infrastructure, that makes our cities and our regions more livable. I also believe that we need to be a science-based nation. I said in my budget reply speech back in May that as a nation we should commit to 3% of our GDP being spent on science and research. Science, infrastructure, education. I also fundamentally believe in fairness. You know, let's talk about inequality. It doesn't always get the coverage it should. Australian statistics show that we're at the most unequal we've been in 75 years. And some of the ways we can deal with inequality, a proper healthcare system, a proper system which tackles discrimination against older people. And I think a 5th area that we can really make this country sing, just treat women equally. We'll start in Labor by 2025, half of our MPs, at least half, will be women. We want to see 50% of all government boards, the positions being at least women, and also we think it's long overdue to tackle domestic violence, which is if this nation does nothing else in the next 15 years, but treats women equally, we're home. We've got a good future.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. It seemed to go very quickly. Please thank tonight's guest, Bill Shorten.
Thanks.
Naturally, we'll be issuing a similar, in fact, we already have issued a similar invitation to the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, to come and join us in the same format. And our thanks to Ballarat's Federation University. It's a great audience here. Please give yourselves a quick round of applause. Thank you. Now, next Monday, Q&A will be joined by the author of the quarterly essay, Profile of Bill Shorten, journalist David Marr, the Minister for Agriculture and Water, Barnaby Joyce, the Shadow Minister for Health, Catherine King, the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs and schoolmate of Bill Shorten, John Roscombe. Until next Monday's Q&A, good night.